Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. I am very excited to share this topic with you. Just a few housekeeping items that I will take questions throughout the presentation, and I have the chat up, and so we'll be watching for any questions that come in. But I also plan to leave some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. To briefly introduce myself, I am Lauren Hayes, and I serve as the Instructional and Research Librarian and co-director of the Center for Games and Learning at Mid-America Nazarene University in Olathe, Kansas. And Olathe is a suburb of Kansas City. We're right on the state line between Kansas and Missouri. So I want to give you a brief background on the work that I do with games and what really makes me, I guess, qualified to speak on this topic. In 2014, I was awarded a Sparks Ignition grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to establish a library-based center for games and learning. For the past couple years, my library has collected over 300 board games. I think at last count we had 322. With access to these games, we have hosted game nights in our library. I think our highest attended one had about 50 people, that's students as well as community members who come. 50 is a pretty good number for us because we're a fairly small liberal arts college. I've also been able to work with local K-12 educators to incorporate games into their classes, and I've found that English language arts teachers and social studies teachers seem to be the primary audience, at least for the teachers that I've had the opportunity to work with, who really seem to understand and want to incorporate games in their classes. We also have conducted 9 case studies on tabletop games in the college classroom, and specifically looking at the use of 21st century skills when students play games. Recently, I guess it wasn't quite as recent anymore, time keeps passing, but in September, I had a book chapter, I co-published a book chapter in a book on experiential learning tools for the academic library. Additionally, I, along with my co-director, have given over 20 presentations on games and learning. The co-director of the Center is a faculty development coordinator at my university, and he wrote his dissertation on video games, religion, and education. His knowledge of game theory is extensive, and he's truly the philosopher of the center. I, on the other hand, tend to speak more from the standpoint of a librarian, because that's what I am, but what I also like to think of as the more practical side of games. So I want to talk briefly about the goals for the Center for Games and Learning. They are that we curate an extensive game collection, we disseminate cutting-edge research on games and learning, and we equip educators to become game designers. We decided to focus on tabletop games because we believe they work as powerful teaching and learning engines. We believe they support experiential learning and social activity. We think that they're more accessible than digital games. We also think that they have a longer lifespan than digital games, and they require players to practice 21st century skills. In libraries where tabletop gaming occurs, library patrons learn to collaborate and communicate shared goals. They ask and answer each other's questions as they create knowledge together. Even though today's digitally saturated culture paradoxically renders us alone together, and that's an idea from Sherry Turkle, in a book she wrote in 2011, socially connected and socially disconnected at the same time, tabletop games counter that culture with a warmth and grace of physical presence. Now, I do not want you to think that we are against video games at all. I have a master's degree in educational technology and love all things tech, and tonight the library is actually hosting our very first digital gaming time this evening. However, when we started our work, we decided to focus on non-digital games for the reasons that I mentioned. And maybe one day in the future we'll be able to do more with video games. However, our primary focus now is tabletop games. So I'd like to get a sense of the audience. Would you mind placing just yes or no in the chat box in response to the question, how many of you have games in your collection? Some, okay, thanks Daniel. Carl, thanks. Ross, great. Okay, so you have video games, but not tabletop games. Okay, so there's a good mix. Okay, so here's my next question for you. And I guess some of you already answered that, but for those of you who did just answer yes, do you have tabletop games or just video games? Both. Okay, thanks, Samantha. Both great. Okay, so there's a good crowd here. Um, and then if you have games in your collection, I'm curious how you use them. So if you could just type in the chat box too, if you use them for game nights or specifically children, teens, recreation for all ages, or possibly something else. Recreation for all ages, great. Now, Carl, I'm not sure what a TT club is. Game nights mostly for teens, Samantha, thanks. Adult programming. Tabletop club at our college. Okay, great. Well, good. I'm glad to see a variety of uses for tabletop games because I really think that that is accurate for how they can be used. They can be used in many different ways. So as we start thinking about tabletop games, I think it is important to first know the variety of games. This acronym was created by Scott Nicholson in his book, Everyone Plays at the Library. As a plug, this is a great book on starting a game program at your library, especially for public libraries. For full disclosure, Scott Nicholson was the consultant on our IMLS grant, but I still think even if he wasn't, that this is a great book. In the work that I've done, it has been helpful to keep the different types of games in mind when making purchasing decisions. It also helps me categorize games when I am considering what will work best in a class setting. The name for each classification type is very descriptive and I believe fairly self-explanatory. Nonetheless, when I first came across this acronym, it helped me to see the range of games I could add to the game collection. As you can see, there are 5 different types of games. Strategy games, such as Monopoly or Risk, is where a strategy should be used to win. Narrative games, such as Dungeons and Dragons, is where the game takes place in a story. Action games, such as Jenga or Kickball, is where players manipulate pieces and move their own bodies. Knowledge games, such as Trivial Pursuit or Scrabble, is where players must know information. And then social games, such as Dictionary or Apples to Apples, are where games are just meant for fun and playing with friends. Now let's talk about 21st century skills. 21st century skills are skills that have been identified as necessary for success in the 21st century. Of course, these skills have always been important, but nevertheless, these skills are being promoted by many institutions, organizations, and schools as critical. According to the P21 Partnership for 21st Century Learning, learning and innovation skills increasingly are being recognized as the skills that separate students who are prepared for increasingly complex life and work environments in the 21st century and those who are not. A focus on creativity, critical thinking, communication, and collaboration are essential to prepare students for the future. In my work, we primarily aligned games with the 4 C's at the top: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And I'll be focusing on the 4 C's in this presentation. The IMLS also has a toolkit that lists all of the 21st century skills, and you can also go to the P21 Partnership for 21st Century Learning to discover all of the skills. Also, if you go to the Center for Games and Learning's website, you can see how we have aligned games to a variety of 21st century skills. You might be thinking, why do this? Why link games with 21st century skills? For us, it was important to align games with these skills for the following reasons. Align fun with a purpose. I do think that fun can just be fun, but when you're writing a grant or trying to get administrative buy-in, sometimes fun needs to be purposeful. Additionally, tabletop games aim to entertain, but they can also do so in a helpful, purposeful, and thoughtful way. Second, making a connection between games and 21st century skills created an easier connection to K-12 schools. K-12 educators have been a very supportive audience, as I mentioned previously. And when we mention 21st century skills, K-12 teachers immediately make the connection that games can be useful in their classroom. Third, this alignment between games and 21st century skills helped us make the case that games can be used in a Common Core curriculum. Also, creating an alignment between 21st century skills and tabletop games has helped us to connect with public libraries in our region. Fifth, connecting 21st century skills and games gives us something concrete to focus on when discussing the benefit of games. And of course, lastly, players of tabletop games really do use 21st century skills. In fact, tabletop games require that players use 21st century skills in order to be successful in the game. Now let's look at some specific games and discuss their alignment with 21st century skills. The descriptions I am going to share are modified from the website boardgamegeek.com, and if you haven't ever been to that website, I highly recommend it. It's a user-curated site with about 80,000 games currently on it, and so pretty much everything you could ever want to know about tabletop games can be found on that site, and I'll say it again, it's boardgamegeek.com. So again, the descriptions are modified from that website as well as the rules for each game. So the first game I want to mention is Dixit. This has been a huge hit with the teachers that I have worked with. Dixit is similar to Apples to Apples, if you've ever played that game. This is a game where each player must caption images and other players guess what caption goes with what picture. So here's a closer look at some of the cards. During each round of the game, the person whose turn it is considered the storyteller. The storyteller will look at the 6 cards in their hand, and then the storyteller will pick one card and then make up a caption. They'll say it out loud, but they'll keep their card a secret. Every other player looks at their cards and selects one of her or his 6 cards that best matches the storyteller's caption. All selected cards are then placed face down in the middle of the table, mixed up, and then all players except the storyteller secretly vote for the card believed to be the storyteller's. Players vote with face-down voting tokens, and then the storyteller will reveal their card. Scoring is determined in the following ways. All players voted, so if all players voted for the storyteller's card, everyone scores 2 points except the storyteller because you want to create a caption that is somewhat opaque. If no players voted for the storyteller's card, everyone scores 2 points except the storyteller. Your caption needs it to make sense with your card. Another rule is if some players guess the storyteller's card, the storyteller scores 3 points plus all the players who voted for the storyteller's card. If all the players except the storyteller gets a bonus point for each vote their card received. This game is fun as it is, but there is certainly a time commitment of around 30 minutes, and the game is made for 3 to 6 players, so it is good that this game does not have to be played according to the published rules. And I see that there's a question that came in about ages are recommended for Dixit. I'd have to look at the box to give you what it actually says. Yeah, starting at age 6. Thanks, Carl. I have played this game with a lot of high school students, and they really get on board with it. But I've also played it even with college students, and they really love it. So I really think that it can be used for a wide range of ages, and especially when you think about some ways that this can be modified, I think that it, again, can be used with a wide range of players. Going along with that idea of how easily modifiable it is that the cards are very surreal, and it can be challenging to caption them. One way to modify the game is to use the cards as storytelling prompts. You could also use the cards in a book discussion, and readers have to select a card that they think best represents the story they just read. So hopefully you see the alignment with creativity. And while I do think Dixit aligns with creativity, it certainly aligns with other skills too. Okay, let's look at another 21st century skill of communication. Pandemic is a cooperative game, and a cooperative game, if you are not familiar with that term, is where all players play together against the game. In this game, each player is a disease-fighting specialist who is trying to stop diseases from spreading. On each turn, a player can use up to 4 actions to travel between cities, fight infected populaces, discover a cure, or build a research station to study cures. A deck of cards provides the players with these abilities, but sprinkled throughout the deck are epidemic cards that accelerate and intensify the disease's activity. A second, separate deck of cards controls the normal spread of diseases. I mentioned that each player takes on a unique role within the team. And so keeping in mind their own role, players must plan their strategy to mesh with the other player's strengths in order to conquer the diseases. This best occurs through discussions with fellow players to determine what is the best action to take during each player's turn. For example, the operations expert can build research stations which are needed to find cures for the diseases and which allow for greater mobility between cities. The scientist needs only 4 cards of a particular disease to cure it instead of the normal 5. But the diseases spread quickly as cards are turned over throughout the game. If 1 or more diseases spreads beyond recovery, or if too much time elapses, the players all lose. However, if they cure the 4 diseases, they all win. And this game is created for 2 to 4 players and takes at least 45 minutes to play. And I will say this game can be really, in my mind, a little overwhelming if you haven't played a cooperative game before. It's fantastic and by far one of my favorite board games that I've had the chance to play. But just keep that in mind, and because the directions can be very thick. And so the directions I gave you are pretty much verbatim from the BoardGameGeek.com website, because I think that that website does a better job of breaking it down than you'll even find in the rule book. Okay, critical thinking. So Ticket to Ride is a very popular game, and in fact, many people call it a gateway game. What I mean by gateway is that it is a game that is often one of the first games people play that is not a standard chance-based game, such as Life or Candyland. And it has elements of the Euro-style game that is currently having its renaissance. In Ticket to Ride, players collect cards of various types of train cars when they then use it to claim railway routes. The longer the route, the more points they earn. Additional points come to those who fulfill destination tickets, goal cards that connect distant cities. Points can also be earned by the player who builds the longest continuous route. Critical thinking skills must be used to determine what decisions to make at what time. For example, players ask themselves, should I claim my destination now or wait to build a longer route? Should I try to focus my routes along the eastern seaboard or expand farther west? This game can be played with 2 to 5 players and takes approximately 45 minutes to play. And I have the United States board up on the screen, but there are Ticket to Ride Asia, Ticket to Ride Europe. I know that there are Nordic countries. So there's maps for Ticket to Ride for all over the world. And that's one thing that I like about this game, because it can also help teach some geography. Excuse me. Okay, collaboration. So Forbidden Island is by the same designer as Pandemic. If you've never played a cooperative game before, I recommend starting with Forbidden Island or Forbidden Desert, which is just another version of this game, as I really believe both Forbidden Island and Forbidden Desert are a bit more accessible than Pandemic. As mentioned earlier, it's important to note how some games align with multiple 21st century skills. Players use communication as well as collaboration skills in this game. In Forbidden Island, players take turns moving their pawns around the island, which is built by arranging tiles. As the game progresses, more and more island tiles sink by being turned over and then removed from the table altogether. Players use strategies to keep the island from sinking while trying to collect treasures and items. As the water level rises, it gets more difficult and players must often make sacrifices. So players must collaborate to retrieve the treasures before the island sinks. And this game is best with 2 to 4 players and takes approximately 30 minutes to play. I selected 4 games for us to review in this webinar. Of course, there are many more that I think are good in a library collection. And as much fun as it is to talk about specific games, I also want to share information about best practices for gameplay in the library. Your staff will likely need to know how to play games to assist patrons. I recommend having multiple copies of games for gameplay events. This decreases the number of games staff need to be familiar with while still accommodating a large crowd. I also recommend having players play a practice round. Don't let that practice round count. This is especially helpful for younger patrons. However, it can be helpful for everyone because it takes the pressure off of those who do not know how to play the game. A third tip I have is that when you are teaching a game for the first time, don't give all the directions up front. Instead, give a few directions. Let everyone playing get to a certain point in the game and then give the next set of directions. This can help with flow and from confusion occurring. As you might be seeing, librarians are the facilitators during a gaming event. When I am hosting a game night in my library, I rarely play with the patrons. In fact, when I hosted one last Friday night, I didn't sit down to play at all. Instead, I tend to focus more on getting the players set up, and then I often need to move on to help another group. If my crowd is small enough, I might be able to sit down, or if the crowd is really comfortable with games and has been coming to the game nights pretty frequently, then they're pretty self-sufficient. But typically, I play the role of host and facilitator. As I hopefully explained, game players will be using 21st century skills by default when they play tabletop games. However, deep learning often occurs during reflection. Earlier this year, I was working with a youth services librarian at an urban library, and she did not see the need to engage in a debriefing exercise after gameplay, but decided to do it anyway because I kept talking about it, I think. A few days later, she reported back to me that it was an amazing experience. She said that teens wanted to talk about their experience in the game. Some would run away to use the restroom and then literally run back to the discussion because they didn't want to miss anything. And these are teens who do not always like to engage, but this was an opportunity for them to connect over something that they were interested and also something that they felt like they were good at. When you're thinking about game debriefing, think about it like you do book clubs. Talk about the experience. And above are a few steps that we have used with the center. That learning goals should initially guide the discussion. So if you're wanting to promote a specific 21st century skill, you might ask players something like, how was it helpful when you discussed with the other players what turn you should make as the scientist in pandemic? You also want to make sure that you listen in order to create dialogue and not just to check off correct answers. So this is something that I know. I come from an education background, so we're not often comfortable when we're leading group discussions when there's silence, but just making sure that we really let the experience sink in and listen to our patrons. We also recommend talking about feelings first. What did you like? What did you not like? about the game. What was the best part of it? What was the worst part of it? Really letting them think through the highs and lows of the experience. Then we also encourage storytelling. Sometimes they won't want to talk in a large group, but they might be willing to turn to their neighbor who might, or probably is their friend, and talk to them about their experience in the game, and then they might be more willing to share with the broader group if they've already had that communication with just one other person. Also think about takeaways. Compare and contrast the game with other content that they've been learning, maybe with something they've been doing at the library, or how it can be like real life. How is the experience of having to work together in the game Pandemic similar to what you might need to do on a class project? So something like that. And then you can always ask them too about modifications and future suggestions, and then let them try those modifications, especially if you work with a population that is a big gaming population. They're probably really thinking about ways that they can modify and get into the game to try new things with it. And I think that also encourages things like design thinking and creativity. And I also think that it's helpful for students who might be, or library patrons who might be interested in going into the field of game design, letting them practice some of those experiences at the library. I see that there's a question from Carl. I'm going to read it for everybody. I tend to break from best practices for teaching and do not outline learning goals before the game, and only do so during reflection or debriefing. Do I have thoughts about this? I think those are good questions. I do tend to outline learning goals before the game, but I don't share those with the students. I know where I'm trying to go, but sometimes I try to get the players to that point through some of the pointed questions I might ask them. But I also really try to listen, and if I realize that they experience something different than I expected them to, I normally try to go in that direction with them, because if that's what they learn from it, I think then I need to be okay with that. And help them really process through that experience. So hopefully that answers your question, Kyle. I'd love to hear more about what you do. So we also have another model by Tiagi, and he does a lot with corporate training, and so he's got a model, and this is specifically for debriefing games, which I think is really interesting. When we at the Center have promoted and used this with classes, and the 6 questions guide the discussion, but other questions are often asked that are appropriate for the game and the discussion. So as you can see, the 6 questions are: how did you feel during the game? What happened during the game? What did you learn during the game? How does that learning connect to your own life experience? How could you use what you learned in another time or place? And what will you do now with this information? And these types of discussions, these types of questions really bring up a lot of good discussion. I'm always amazed at just how willing students and teens and even adults are to talk about the experience that they're having. I'll give one example that it's probably one of my favorite examples that for the past 3 years, I believe, I've been working with a business professor here at the university where I work, and he has incorporated the game Forbidden Island, which I spoke about earlier, to teach the differences between management and leadership, because it is that cooperative game. So he has the students play the game, and then they debrief about, okay, what happened when you engaged in skills or engaged in actions that were more in the management category or what happened when you engaged in actions that were more in the leadership category. And so the students have to really process through their own actions and then the outcomes of those actions on how successful they were in the game. It's been a really positive experience, and the first time he ran it, he only took about, I think maybe he took 3 class periods. So it's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, 50 minutes, and so he took a full week. This year, he just finished running it, and he actually spent 2 full weeks on it. I was really surprised he was willing to give up that much class time or devote that much class time to this game, but he just thought that the experiences that they were getting through the game were so much richer than what they would have gotten through a lecture. And so I think that's probably one of the true wins that I think we've had with the Center for Games and Learning. So as I said, I would leave time at the end for questions. It's really been my pleasure to share all of this with you, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have. So I'm going to watch the chat box and see if any come in. Not seeing any, but I'll give it a little more time. I'll also say, though, that I am happy to talk to any of you who might want to think more deeply about this, or just kind of brainstorm some things that might work well at your institution. And so my contact information is on the screen. Feel free to email me directly, or there's also my Twitter handle. I'm on Twitter quite a bit. So again, I'd be happy to. And I see some questions coming in. Okay, Carl, how have you managed the pieces in a game like Pandemic for lending? That's a great question. So one thing that we do for games, because you're right, we do lend the games, we do check them out to local teachers, and we even let students check them out, is that we do a couple things. Whenever we get a new game in, we create a list of all the pieces and then laminate it and then tape it to the inside of the front cover of the box, so that way if the rules ever get lost or something, that the person who has it checked out can quickly see the contents list and then make sure they have everything. We have a lot of student workers, which is one thing that we are lucky with working at an academic institution. And so I actually have assigned a student that it's her responsibility to count all of the game pieces when they come back in. I don't know that she likes me all the time, but when something does go missing, we handle that just the way that we would handle a missing or a damaged book that comes back in. That it becomes the patron's responsibility. I will say that I have been surprised at the number of game companies that are willing to send replacement pieces, and so I can often get a replacement piece pretty easily, and if I'm able to do that, I don't make the patron pay for it. I can go online, if it's like a HABA game, I know I just got a piece from HABA, and they'll just send it for free. Some other things that I've found that work really well is you can buy, especially like a game like Settlers of Catan, which has a lot of really small pieces, you can buy just full boxes of replacement pieces on a site like Amazon for a pretty inexpensive amount. And so we did do that. We purchased extra dice. We've purchased extra basic like game pieces, things like Monopoly, and so often we have extra pieces on hand for a lot of the games. Daniel, have you used Hanabi as an intro to collaborative games? We do have that game, yes, and I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, so I apologize because I've never actually had to say it out loud. I haven't used it for an intro to collaborative games, but that is a really interesting idea. I hadn't really thought about that. But I think a lot of our students have been familiar with a cooperative game, but I like the idea of working with patrons who haven't had that experience to use that game. So that's a great idea, Daniel. Samantha, what's my favorite game? I think I mentioned that I really like Pandemic. So that is one of my absolute favorite games. I don't tend to naturally be a real competitive person, and so I really like cooperative games because of that. I would prefer to work with my teammates on a challenge together, and so I think that's probably why I'm drawn to those types of games. And there's especially in Pandemic, there's also a lot of things going on, and so I enjoy having to kind of process through everything. But there's some other games, Bandu. That's not one I mentioned, but it's a dexterity game where you have to build towers with funny shaped pieces. It's kind of similar to Jenga, but it's Jenga backwards and with funny shaped pieces. I also really like that one, and pretty much everyone who's ever played Bandu loves it as well. Okay, how do I advertise game events? So we've done a few different things. Some have worked better than others. We make flyers. We also use social media to advertise the game events. One thing we've done is there's a pretty large homeschooling population around our area, and they all have a Facebook account. And so we have connected with their kind of social media coordinator for their homeschooling group, and they will advertise the games, and so the game nights, and so that gets outside constituents into our library that wouldn't have any idea or any real reason to come on our campus. More internally on campus, those flyers, having announcements made on kind of the internal television network, and then even putting it in the student newspaper. Those things have all worked really, really well. One thing that I did last time, just because I wanted to see how it worked, is I actually had a student worker that it was their responsibility to be in charge of advertising everything, and so I kind of stepped away from that to focus more on just some other responsibilities that I have at my job. And we didn't have probably as much of a turnout or as great of a turnout as we've had at other ones. I think we had about 25 attend last Friday night, but nonetheless, that's not bad. And I think that it was really nice having a student worker able to help with some of that, and she was responsible for making the flyers and contacting the internal television network. Okay, Susan, we weigh our games on a food scale that shows the weight okay, yeah, the 10th or the 100th of an ounce. We just weigh the games as they come in and out to determine if everything is there. So fast and easy. I've actually heard about that, Susan, and I would love to be able to do that here. I don't have all the say in the money that gets spent, so we haven't done that, but I think for a lot of libraries, that's probably the way to go. I hear that they do that at big gaming conventions, actually, so I think you are on the money there with that one. Well, great. Thanks for all these questions. Any other ones that are, anything else that prompt any other questions? I'm not seeing any more come in. So I'll just reiterate one thing that I said earlier, just that I am always happy to answer any questions that anybody has. And I would love to hear really what some of you are doing with games in your libraries. I think that having the opportunity to learn from each other, just, you know, with Susan's example, is fantastic. And we all do different things, and when we can get our collective brains together, we can do even greater things. Okay, I see a question from Daniel. Have you ever tried or seen a library try doing a narrative gaming session, such as Dungeons and Dragons? Yes. So I mentioned that I'm in the Kansas City metro area, and I'll say that the Kansas City Public Library is very heavily involved in Dungeons and Dragons and do a lot with their teen group with that game. And so I would, if this is something you're interested in, I would be happy to connect you with the person I know who runs that over there. I know that when her and I were first talking, she said that she had to go learn how to play herself, but she knew that it was something that all the teens in her area were really interested in. And it's an area where a lot of the patrons walk to the library, and so they just really felt like it was something that was very important for them to spend time on. And I kind of chuckled having to learn that. And so I'm not a D&D player myself, but I understand the basics of it. And she said it was definitely a learning curve, but that once she's learned it, it's a lot of fun. So yeah, so if you want to send me an email, Daniel, I'd be happy to connect you if you'd like to hear more about that. Great, I'll be looking for your email. Have I tried drafting games? We do have Seven Wonders and we do have Sushi Go, both in our game collection. So yes, I think that incorporating games such as those into your game nights is a great idea. How does the library benefit from having players that are not students or part of the university population? So that's a good question. My library made a decision probably 10 years or so ago to be open to the community. Part of the reason for that is we felt it was an opportunity for us to help market our university, and so we do see it as kind of doing our part, I guess, for good, strong community relations. It definitely creates some internal challenges here. I'm not going to say that it's always a smooth road being open to the community, but it's just a decision we made, and it has been really beneficial, just in the sense that it allows us to create good partnerships with the community. It's I think, and it's built a lot of good community rapport in a different way than I think traditional marketing avenues can have. So I guess that's the benefit. It might not be library specific benefit, but it is more for the growth of our university. I hope that makes sense. So Vicky asks, what do you mean by drafting games? And so I might let Daniel explain exactly what he means by that word, because I think he and I are on the same page about it. But typically, when I think of that, I think of games that, when you lose, you're not necessarily out, and so that way players can keep playing, and so they're not just sitting around waiting for the next turn or the game to start over again. Okay. So maybe we're thinking of different ways to interpret that word. Thanks, Carl, for jumping in there. Yeah, see, one thing that, and I'm going to kind of jump off of that, one thing that we have really struggled with is the idea of, okay, what happens when a player gets out and then they're left without anything to do while everybody else is playing the game. And so I think the idea of being able to have games where players are always or involved at least for the majority of the game, and so they can't get out really early, is an important consideration when you're thinking about games. Any suggestions for games to use in academic libraries? So all of these games that I have mentioned are ones that we have in our collection in my academic library. And I think that some of the games that you would include are probably going to be specific to your needs. If you're thinking about games that maybe align the best with curriculum, a game such as So what? Okay, here's an example. The game Diplomacy. A lot of people have heard of that, but it takes I think BoardGameGeek.com says it takes like 360 minutes to play. Well, nobody has enough time to play that game, but there's a lot of really good content that our history professor wanted to use. And so what we did is we modified the game where each class period they'd take like 3 to 5 minutes and they'd play a round. Um, or play one turn of diplomacy, and they ended up playing it over like a 3 to 4 week period. So even though some of the games might not think that you're going to work perfectly in a class setting, there are ways to modify so many games. And I focused on 21st century skills in this presentation and how the library can really support those skills and what they do. But there's, of course, also games like Diplomacy that align well with curriculum that's taught. And Susan put in her game list, and I will go ahead and type in, that's the URL to our game collection. And so if you just hit game list, I think over on the left-hand side, you can see the games that we have in the collection. There might be a few that I've added in the last month that I haven't gotten on the website yet, but the vast majority of the games are there. And we also have them all linked to 21st century skills, and so you can filter by skill or by game type. Well, I'm very pleased that there are so many questions and comments. I'm excited about that. So thank you all for jumping in and asking questions. I'll ask one more time. Anything else that I can answer? Well, great. Thank you. Well, I don't see any more, and I'm seeing some thank yous, so I think that is going to conclude our time together today. Again, though, I will just say, please reach out if you have any more questions. I would enjoy hearing from all of you. Thank you.